Most people talk about the Black Death like it was only a nightmare of death and despair, which, to be fair, it absolutely was. But buried behind the tragedy is a strange twist hardly anyone mentions, without meaning to, that plague helped build the world we're living in right now. Not because people rebuilt the same society afterward, but because the people who lived through it made choices that flipped the entire structure of Europe upside down, and it happened quietly, almost accidentally. Think about this plague for a moment. Between the late 1340s and early 1350s, the population collapse wasn't small or symbolic. It was brutal and immediate. Entire streets, fields, workshops, and churches suddenly lost half of the faces that filled them. Imagine waking up and realizing every second person you know is simply gone, not moved away, not retired, just missing from the world. Empty chairs, silent workshops, cold hearths. You'd think the world would stop and fall apart completely, but here's where the story changes direction. The ones left behind found themselves in a position no one had ever expected. Suddenly, the poorest people in Europe, people who could be fined or whipped for leaving their lord's land, had something priceless: leverage. Work didn't stop just because half of Europe vanished. Fields needed harvesting, walls needed building, animals still needed tending. Except the workforce they relied on had disappeared, and those few who remained started to speak up in ways that would have gotten them punished only a few years earlier. Pay more, they said. Offer land, offer freedom. The people in charge were terrified, so terrified that kings tried to fix wages by law. France tried. England tried. In some places, wage control became punishable by prison. But you can't arrest half your workers when you barely have workers to begin with. Laws failed because reality didn't care. Suddenly, families who had been scraping dirt all their lives started negotiating like businessmen. A woman who once earned a penny for spinning wool could now demand 4. A farmhand could walk away and take a better deal down the road. The entire idea that a person's birth decided their future started shaking like a failing dam. It's wild when you think about it. A catastrophe created the biggest labor advantage common people had ever seen. A giant job market with too many jobs and not enough people. It wasn't glamorous, but it was power, and the first real economic power many peasants had ever tasted. But wages were only the beginning, because when a population disappears that fast, something else becomes available in uncomfortable abundance. Land, not a small garden patch either. Large fields, barns, entire farms, estates that had been worked by families for generations. Gone. Just sitting there. And when nobody is alive to inherit, land becomes negotiable. Some people walked onto abandoned plots and simply stayed. Others rented at a laughably cheap rate because landlords were desperate for anyone to bring land back to life. And those who were clever didn't take the first field offered. They took the best ones, the rich soil, the close-to-water land. Suddenly farming wasn't just survival, it became opportunity. And here's where the accidental innovation kicks in. With fewer hands, people changed what they planted and how they farmed. Difficult crops made less sense when wool could be traded overseas for better profit. Sheep didn't need daily supervision the way wheat did. And that shift toward wool wasn't random, it reshaped entire economies. Textile trade exploded, rural land became money, merchants became wealthy. Families who had never handled more than a handful of coins began hiring laborers themselves. Suddenly the line between peasant and landowner blurred. It wasn't just the countryside that transformed. Cities, those empty, grieving places, became magnets for ambitious survivors. When half of your competitors vanish, a bakery becomes a gold mine. A blacksmith shop with only one surviving smith turns into a community necessity. A leather worker, a carpenter, a cooper, anyone who could make, repair, or sell anything suddenly found themselves indispensable. Some cities shrank permanently. Others grew like they'd been injected with rocket fuel. Trade routes reopened. Ships returned. And with fewer people crowding streets, the ones left had room physically and financially to try things nobody had dared attempt before. Someone needed to lend money to rebuild, so banking evolved. Someone needed to manage trade across borders, so accounting evolved. Someone needed to structure apprenticeships and skills, so guilds shifted and new trades formed. A world driven by coins rather than obligation took shape, not all at once but faster than anyone expected. And in the middle of that economic reshuffling came something even stranger: freedom of movement. A farm worker could walk to the next town to negotiate his future. A merchant's daughter could learn her father's trade and shockingly get paid for it. and widows suddenly found themselves not just property holders but business owners because there was nobody else left to inherit. This wasn't planned. No council sat down and designed a new social system. It happened because half the pieces fell off the board, and the survivors rearranged what remained in ways that made life slightly easier, slightly richer, and far more flexible. But the economy wasn't the only thing that cracked open. Something far deeper started rumbling beneath the surface. Belief, the faith that had tied society together for centuries, hit a crisis no prayer seemed to fix. Priests died just as quickly as peasants. Holy relics failed to protect entire towns. When some clergy ran for the hills instead of helping, people noticed. And when the church couldn't explain why the faithful died alongside the sinful, trust began to wobble. Others ran in the opposite direction. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves raw, convinced a furious heaven demanded suffering. Some blamed themselves, many blamed outsiders. But quietly, in small circles, a new kind of thought began to form. If the people in charge don't have the answers, maybe the answers must be found somewhere else. And that urge to question instead of obey was the beginning of something far bigger than the plague itself. Something strange began happening after the Black Death. Knowledge started slipping out of the shadows. Not in a dramatic Hollywood type of way, more like quiet flickers of curiosity appearing where fear used to live. For generations before the plague, books were rare. Reading was reserved for the chosen few, and every big question had one official answer: the church's answer. But when that system shook, even a little, new spaces opened up for ideas that had been gathering dust for centuries. Monasteries that had always been full of quiet scribes found themselves nearly empty. Those who survived had time they never had before to explore the old Greek and Roman writings stored in the corners of their libraries. Philosophers, mathematicians, physicians whose work had been ignored suddenly had new life breathed into it. And it wasn't just the monks anymore. Merchants who inherited wealth, craftsmen who became business owners, even widows who found themselves running shops. Many of them began paying scholars, artists, and thinkers to teach, to write, to sculpt, to question. People didn't use the word Renaissance at the time. They thought they were simply trying to understand a world that no longer made sense. They wanted meaning after witnessing death arrive silently and without explanation. When your worldview collapses, your mind tries to rebuild something sturdier in its place. That desire to understand life, not just the afterlife, sparked creativity in every direction. Painters stopped drawing everyone like identical saints and started painting individual faces, emotions, gestures. Writers described life, humor, sadness, love, things too ordinary to matter before. Sculptors carved human bodies with detail so precise it shocked viewers accustomed only to symbolic art. And here's the surprise: this shift wasn't born out of confidence. It came from trauma, from survivors realizing the world could change in a week, and life was worth paying attention to, documenting, celebrating while it existed. People turned their curiosity toward the human body itself, something medieval medicine had rarely examined with honesty. Before the plague, the medical world leaned heavily on ancient theories, especially the idea of balancing humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. That theory had survived unchallenged for so long that doctors treated anything from headaches to heartbreak with the same solution: bleed the patient and pray. But when patients died, regardless of how many jars of blood you drained, confidence in these methods faded like smoke. Some places, especially trade cities where foreign ideas entered quickly, began changing how they approached sickness. One of the most revolutionary ideas was stunningly simple: observe the patient. Not the stars, not the humors, not the old books. The person. Doctors began writing down symptoms. They compared patterns. They noted outcomes. Without calling it science, they began practicing something closer to it. Hospitals, which had mostly been places to die, slowly shifted toward places to treat. Some cities created isolation areas. Others organized teams to clean streets. Venice famously forced ships to wait before docking. The beginning of quarantine as we know it. People didn't understand germs, but they understood that sickness could spread. And noticing cause and effect, even without explanation, saved lives. Medicine wasn't the only field changing. The economy was rewriting itself too, and not politely. Before the plague, wealth was measured mostly in land. A good harvest meant power. A bad one meant revolt. Money existed, but it wasn't the heartbeat of everyday life. After the plague, everything flipped. When merchants began moving wool, fabrics, tools, and luxury goods across borders, coins became more valuable than fields. People needed capital, loans,
Bookkeeping services only a few families understood well enough to provide. Banking houses emerged, not tiny lending desks in noisy markets, but organized financial systems with branches in multiple cities. A merchant in Florence could send money safely to London without carrying it. Credit became a tool instead of a crime. Profit became respectable, even admirable. And with that shift came something the old world had never truly embraced: social mobility. A farmer's son could become a merchant. A merchant's daughter could run a business. A craftsman could train apprentices and expand. A widow could take her late husband's trade and build it larger than he ever did. Women stepped into roles that had long been closed, not because society had become enlightened overnight, but because survival demanded skill, not permission. A lull brewing in England was nearly taken over by women, alewives they were called, because someone had to produce the drink people consumed every day when water wasn't safe. In towns across Europe, women became innkeepers, textile merchants, mill managers, midwives, healers, and money handlers. Some signed contracts, some sued and won, some became respected or resented in ways unthinkable before. It wasn't a revolution by protest, it was a revolution by vacancy. When half the seats are empty, the remaining people sit wherever they must. These practical changes eventually collided with something far more delicate: belief. The plague triggered the biggest identity crisis the church had ever faced in Europe. For centuries, priests were seen as guides between humanity and the divine. When fear came, people turned to them, but when the plague arrived and never left, many priests fell alongside their parishioners, and some abandoned their flocks entirely. This betrayal planted a quiet seed. If the people blessed with holy authority could die just as helplessly, how much authority did they truly hold? Some reacted with wild zeal, whipping themselves publicly, seeking forgiveness through pain. Others turned inward, seeking private connection with God. Mystics, radical thinkers, wanderers with new ideas gained followers. People weren't losing faith, they were rethinking who controlled it. They questioned corruption, they questioned translation, they questioned whether ordinary people should have access to sacred texts. Movements formed, books were copied, whispers spread in taverns, in workshops, in homes lit with tallow candles. The old structure had fractures, and through those cracks came questions that no one could stop once they began. All of these changes, labor, land, cities, knowledge, medicine, religion, finance, were connected like threads in one massive tapestry pulled loose and rewoven by accident. The Black Death didn't design a new world, it forced survivors to build one while learning on the run. Which brings us to one group that experienced this transformation in a strange, unexpected way: the rising business class. The newly wealthy, merchants, bankers, wool traders, weren't nobles by birth, but they held something nobles desperately needed: money. With capital came influence. With influence came marriage arrangements, political alliances, and new forms of power. Castles were no longer the only symbols of authority. Counting houses and guild halls began replacing fortresses. The center of power started shifting from rural estates to busy streets where ships unloaded goods and craftsmen shouted prices over market chaos. Europe wasn't just recovering, it was changing its orbit. Survivors raised children who grew up knowing two things: the world could end quickly, and opportunity belonged to those bold enough to take it. And in the shadow of that realization, something even larger was forming: a new attitude toward human ability itself. If the world was unpredictable, then waiting for answers wasn't enough. Thinking, building, experimenting, these became forms of hope. Ideas spread faster than disease had. People traveled not just to survive, but to trade, study. From this restless age, new thinkers would emerge: artists, inventors, navigators, and scholars who were raised by parents who had survived the darkest years Europe had ever seen.